I had been married to Langston Harrington for 14 months, yet not once had my lips touched my husband's. In the eyes of the world, I was Mrs. Harrington, the young wife of a Harlem billionaire, a woman who should have been living a dream inside a glass palace on Central Park West. But the truth was far colder than the glittering facade suggested. My name was Imani Carter, 26 years old, and the only reason I stood in that penthouse was because of a contract signed in desperation. Langston was 32, heir to the Harrington Empire, and a man whose every movement was sharp, measured, and deliberate. When my mother, Imani Carter, fell gravely ill, and the bills towered over us like walls closing in, Langston's proposal had come like a lifeline. A marriage on paper, a union of names, and in exchange, every hospital expense erased. I had promised myself that saving my mother was worth the cost of my heart. From the moment I stepped into his world, it became clear that this arrangement was no fairy tale. Each morning I awoke to the sound of his footsteps across the polished floors, the steady rhythm of his routine as he prepared for another day of empire building. He dressed with precision, tailored suits, silk ties, cufflinks that gleamed like little shields of wealth. I watched him knot his tie, waiting for his gaze to fall on me with some spark of recognition, waiting for the intimacy that should come naturally between husband and wife. But his eyes never lingered. To him, I was another fixture of the penthouse, as silent and polished as the marble floors beneath us. The penthouse itself was magnificent, perched high above Central Park with glass walls that framed the skyline in sweeping views. But inside, the air felt as cold and lifeless as the steel and glass that encased it. Luxury stretched out in every direction, Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers, furniture too expensive to touch, but none of it warmed the silence that suffocated me. It was a monument to wealth without warmth, a museum where I lived as a quiet exhibit. I tried to fill the emptiness with small gestures. I cooked his favorite meals, left notes on his desk, even asked about his work, hoping to bridge the chasm between us. Each effort was met with polite nods, distracted replies, or silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. He spoke in clipped tones, eyes always on his phone, fingers scrolling through markets and mergers instead of reaching for me. Nights were worse. We shared the same bed, but his body stayed distant. The space between us wide as an ocean. Sometimes, I would sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows, notebook balanced on my knees, and scribble the words I could never say aloud. Words about longing, about being invisible, about craving a touch that never came. My pen bled with emotions he never noticed. I wanted him to see me, not as a wife bound by obligation, but as a woman with dreams. A woman who could love and be loved in return, and yet the silence never broke. Each time I whispered in the dark, asking myself if this was what love was meant to feel like. The city below offered no answer. Only the low hum of traffic and the quiet ache of my own heart filled the room. The penthouse on Central Park West was meant to be a symbol of status, but to me it was nothing more than a gilded cage. From the outside, people saw elegance, gleaming marble floors, walls of glass that opened to a breathtaking skyline, and rooms filled with art worth more than entire neighborhoods. But once the doors closed, the silence became unbearable, stretching long and heavy through every corridor. Every corner of that apartment was curated for perfection, yet it all felt lifeless. The chandeliers sparkled, but their light was cold. The furniture was flawless, yet it offered no comfort. The carpets muffled footsteps until even sound itself felt smothered. Wealth echoed in every detail, but warmth was nowhere to be found. It was a palace built for appearances, not for living. Langston thrived in that kind of environment, orderly, immaculate, untouchable. He moved through the rooms like a shadow in a perfectly tailored suit, never breaking stride, never pausing to notice how hollow it all felt. To him, success was measured in contracts signed and properties acquired, not in laughter that filled the air or the comfort of a hand held at the end of a long day. I tried to fit myself into his world, but the loneliness clung to me like a second skin. Some days, I would sit at the grand piano in the corner, my fingers hovering above the keys, tempted to play the songs my mother once taught me. But I never pressed down. Music felt out of place there, too alive for walls that demanded silence. Nights were the hardest. The penthouse glittered like a jewel against the city lights, but inside I felt invisible. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until morning, waiting for something, anything that would make me feel like more than a tenant in my own marriage. Langston slept beside me, his back turned, his breathing steady, a wall of distance I could never climb. It wasn't that I wanted extravagant declarations or lavish gifts. What I longed for was simple. One moment where his gaze softened when it landed on me. One night where his hand reached for mine without hesitation. But the days slipped by in silence, and the space between us only widened. The world believed I was living a dream. But inside those pristine walls, my reality was clear. I was trapped in a mansion that looked like paradise, but felt colder than any winter outside. I refused to believe that silence was the only language we would ever speak. Somewhere beneath Langston Harrington's armor of business suits and controlled expressions, I wanted to believe there was still a man who could laugh, who could listen, who could love. So I tried, again and again, to bridge the distance between us. At breakfast, I would ask him about his meetings, hoping conversation might slip into something more personal. "How did yesterday's negotiations go?" I'd venture, my voice light, inviting. He would glance up briefly, give a curt answer like, "Profitable," and return to scanning stock reports on his tablet. If I tried to steer the talk toward us, toward whether he'd ever wanted children, or even just what books he read when he was younger, he would deflect, as though my words were nothing more than background noise. Evenings. I set the table with care, cooking meals my mother once made, spiced chicken, collard greens cornbread warm from the oven, food that carried memories of love, of family, of conversations that lingered long after plates were empty. Langston would sit across from me, impeccably polite, thank me for the effort, and then eat in silence. His eyes stayed fixed on the financial pages of the newspaper, or on the phone that buzzed with endless demands from his office downtown. I tried suggesting things we could do together. "There's an exhibit at the Studio Museum in Harlem this weekend," I told him once, hopeful. "I think you'd like it. It's about history, about legacy." But he cut me off with a shake of his head, murmuring that his schedule was already full. When I mentioned that we could at least take a walk in Central Park after dinner, he didn't even respond. Each attempt left me feeling smaller, my voice swallowed up by the vast emptiness of our life. I watched him pour himself into deals and conferences, meetings that stretched late into the night, until I realized the truth. He gave all his passion to his work, and left none for me, but still I kept trying. I left little notes in his briefcase, lines of poetry I scribbled in my notebook, words I wished he would one day echo back to me. I folded his ties neatly, brewed his coffee exactly the way he liked, even adjusted my schedule so I could greet him at the door when he returned late. He always offered a polite nod, a faint smile, sometimes a quick thank you, but never the thing I craved most, to feel like his wife. Not just a shadow occupying the same space. Each failed attempt chipped away at me, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. Deep down, I clung to the fragile hope that one day, something I said or did might finally break through the fortress around his heart. The night of the Apollo Theater Gala arrived with all the glitter and spectacle Harlem could hold. The Harrington name was printed in bold across the programs, and our presence was expected as if we were royalty. Langston thrived in that atmosphere. Flawless tuxedo, polished shoes, handshake after handshake with investors, politicians, and socialites. I walked beside him in a sleek gown, my arm linked with his, smiling when cameras flashed, nodding when strangers greeted me as if I were part of a perfect picture. But inside, I felt like a prop, the music, the laughter, the champagne flowing under chandeliers. It all seemed distant, a world spinning around me while I stood still. Langston's grip on my arm was steady, but impersonal, more like an escort guiding me across a stage than a husband holding his wife close. He introduced me as Imani, but his voice carried no warmth, no pride, no tenderness. I tried to play the part. I smiled for photographs, laughed politely at conversations I barely followed, and held my glass of champagne as though it anchored me in place. Yet my heart ached with every moment he turned away, more invested in discussing mergers than in acknowledging that I existed. Eventually I slipped away. The gala's terrace stretched open to the night, overlooking the streets of Harlem, glowing under city lights. The cool air kissed my skin, a relief after the suffocating room inside. I leaned against the stone railing, gazing at the city that felt alive in ways my marriage never had. I thought I was alone until I heard footsteps behind me. Langston's voice cut through the quiet. "You disappeared," he said, his tone calm, controlled, as if this were just another business observation. I turned toward him, something raw rising in my chest. For months I had swallowed my words, but that night the silence became too heavy to bear. "Do you even notice me, Langston?" I asked, my voice trembling but firm. "Do you see me as anything other than a name on paper, a body to stand beside you at events like this?" His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering away before settling back on me. "This is the life we agreed to," he said evenly. "No," I whispered, anger mixing with sorrow. "This is the life you dictated. I signed that contract because my mother was dying, because I had no choice. But marriage is supposed to be more than hospital bills and business transactions. I'm supposed to be your wife, not a ghost haunting your perfect world." For a moment, something cracked in his expression. An emotion, a hesitation, quickly buried beneath the mask he always wore. His silence pressed harder than any words. I shook my head, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. "You spend your days building empires, Langston, but you can't give me even one moment of yourself. Do you know what it feels like to lie next to someone every night and still feel completely invisible?" The city hummed around us, but between us there was only the ache of unspoken truths. He didn't reach for me, didn't argue, didn't promise change. He simply stood there, towering in his silence, and I realized that my words had landed against a wall that might never break. That was the night something inside me shifted. For the first time, I wondered not just how long I could endure this life, but whether I wanted to endure it at all. After the gala, the days inside the penthouse grew heavier. The silence felt sharper, every glance from Langston colder, every conversation shorter. I started finding excuses to leave, to step outside those glass walls that made me feel like a prisoner in silk. One afternoon, I wandered down Lenox Avenue, drawn to a place I hadn't visited in months, Uptown Grounds. A cozy cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. The moment I walked in, the smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around me like a hug. The chatter of students, the soft jazz playing in the background, the clatter of mugs. It was messy, alive, real. Everything my home wasn't. I ordered a latte and settled at a corner table, pulling out my worn notebook. Its pages had been neglected, filled with half-finished lines of poetry, words I had once written with fire but now scribbled out in hesitation. For the first time in a long while I let my pen move, spilling pieces of myself I had buried in silence. "Imani." The voice startled me. I looked up to see Jamal Rivers, an old friend from college. Back then, he had been a passionate poet, the kind of man who believed words could shake the world. Now he was still the same. Warm eyes, easy smile, notebook tucked under his arm like a second skin. "Jamal," I breathed, surprised. "It's been years," he laughed, sliding into the seat across from me. "I thought that was you. Mrs. Harrington now, huh? Uptown royalty." His tone was teasing, but his eyes softened when he noticed the tiredness behind my smile. "How are you really?" The question undid me more than I expected. I shrugged, looking down at the coffee swirling in my cup. "Living in a palace doesn't mean you feel like a queen," I admitted quietly. He didn't push. Instead, he reached for his notebook, flipping it open to a page covered in verses. "Still writing?" he asked gently. "Not like I used to." "You should," he said simply. "Your words had a way of cutting straight to the heart." He leaned forward. "The world doesn't need perfect. It needs real. Don't let silence steal that from you." His words lit something fragile inside me, a spark I thought I had lost. For a moment, sitting in that noisy cafe, I felt like myself again. Not Mrs. Harrington, not a ghost in a penthouse, but Imani Carter, the girl who once believed her voice mattered. When I left Uptown Grounds that day, Notebook tucked tightly under my arm, I carried more than coffee and scribbled lines. I carried hope, the smallest, faintest reminder that maybe I still had pieces of myself worth saving. I decided to try one more time. After weeks of silence and distance, after nights of lying beside a man who treated me like an obligation instead of a wife, I still clung to a thread of hope. Maybe if I created the right moment, maybe if I reminded him of what intimacy could look like, he would finally meet me halfway. So I planned a dinner. I spent the day preparing everything myself, refusing to let the house staff handle it. I wanted it to come from me, from my hands and my heart. I cooked the dishes my mother once made for special occasions: tender oxtail stew, rice and peas, cornbread, and sweet plantains caramelized just right. I set the table with our best china, lit tall white candles that cast a golden glow over the dining room, and placed a vase of fresh lilies at the center. When I was finished, the room looked warm, inviting, alive. Everything our marriage had not been. I changed into a simple but elegant dress, the kind I knew once would have made men's eyes linger. I styled my hair, added a touch of red lipstick, and for the first time in months, I looked in the mirror and felt beautiful. All I wanted was for Langston to walk in, see me, and remember that I was not just part of a contract but a woman who wanted to be loved. When he finally arrived, I heard the click of the front door and the low murmur of his voice as he answered a call. He walked into the dining room, still speaking to whoever was on the other end, his phone pressed against his ear, his expression locked in that permanent mask of business. "Langston," I greeted softly. Standing by the table, my heart pounding, he gave me a quick nod, his eyes skimming over the candles, the food, the effort. But he didn't pause, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge it beyond that fleeting glance. He mouthed a silent 1 minute to me, then turned his back and walked toward his office, still talking numbers and deals into the phone. I stood there frozen, the candle flames flickering in the silence he left behind. Minutes passed, then 20, then nearly an hour. The food cooled, the wax dripped, and I sat alone at the table I had set for two. That was the moment something in me broke. I realized that no matter how many meals I cooked, how many notes I left, how many times I tried to reach across the distance, Langston Harrington would never meet me there. His world was built of walls too thick for love to enter, and I was done bleeding against them. By the time he finally emerged from his office, loosening his tie, I was already clearing the plates, my face a mask of quiet resolve. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I didn't wait. I walked past him without a word, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step carrying me closer to a decision I should have made long ago. That dinner had been my last attempt. Now, it was my last straw. That night, after clearing the cold plates and blowing out the melted candles, I sat at my vanity and stared at the woman in the mirror. My makeup had smudged, my eyes were tired, but the quiet fire inside me was burning clearer than it ever had. I could not keep waiting for love that was never going to come. I pulled open the drawer where I kept the little box that had changed everything, the velvet case that once held the Harrington wedding ring. The symbol of a bargain, not a union. I placed the ring on the desk beside me and reached for a sheet of paper. My hand trembled, but my words did not. "Langston, I can't live in silence any longer. I married you because I had no choice, but I stayed because I kept hoping you would see me, even once. Tonight showed me the truth. You never will. I need more than marble walls and a famous last name. I need laughter, music, warmth, and love. I need to be more than invisible. I am leaving, not because I hate you, but because I refuse to keep losing myself. I hope one day you understand what it means to let someone in. Goodbye." Imani, I folded the note neatly, set it beside the ring, and slid both onto his desk where I knew he would find them. My heart pounded, but instead of fear, I felt relief. I packed quickly, taking only the essentials, some clothes, my notebooks, a small framed photo of Mama. I slipped out of the penthouse quietly, the city night wrapping around me like freedom. The doorman looked surprised but said nothing as I wheeled a single suitcase past him and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cab ride to Queens felt like shedding a heavy coat I had been forced to wear for too long. When I unlocked the door to the tiny studio apartment in Jamaica that I had secretly rented weeks earlier, the space welcomed me with its chipped paint, second-hand furniture, and the faint hum of traffic outside the window. It was small, imperfect, alive. I sat cross-legged on the floor, my notebook open on my lap, pen in hand. For the first time in over a year, words flowed freely. They weren't polished or perfect, but they were mine. Lines about love and loss, about caged hearts and broken silence, about the fragile beauty of starting over. As I scribbled beneath the soft glow of a single lamp, I felt the weight lift from my chest. The penthouse had been a prison, but here, in this humble little room, I felt something I hadn't in months. Hope Langston found the note the next morning. I could imagine it. The way his expression must have flickered when his eyes moved from my handwriting to the ring lying still on his desk. For once, it wasn't a contract or a stock report demanding his attention. It was me, finally gone. By the time he reached the empty bedroom and saw the closet half cleared, it was too late. I was already in Queens, learning how to breathe again. But Langston Harrington was not a man who accepted silence on someone else's terms. That evening, as I packed groceries into the tiny cupboard of my studio, a knock rattled my door. My chest tightened when I opened it and saw him standing there, still in his tailored suit, but disheveled in a way I had never seen. His tie hung loose, his eyes were raw, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked less like an untouchable mogul and more like a man stripped of certainty. "Imani," he said. My name rough on his lips, I froze, every instinct screaming to shut the door, to protect the fragile peace I had just begun to build. But he pressed on. "We need to talk." "I think we said everything there was to say," I replied quietly. He shook his head, stepping closer. "No, you spoke and I stayed silent. I can't do that anymore. I wanted to resist, but some part of me needed to hear what he had buried all this time. Against my better judgment, I let him in." The studio seemed even smaller with him inside, his tall frame out of place against the peeling paint and second-hand furniture. He looked around as if seeing the life I had chosen, humble, real. And then his eyes came back to me. "You think I don't see you," he said, his voice low, almost breaking. "But I do. Every single day. I just didn't know how to let you see me back." I frowned, confused, angry. "What does that even mean, Langston? You had every chance. You had me right there, begging for something as simple as a word, a touch. You gave me nothing." His shoulders stiffened, then sagged as if the weight of years pressed down on him. "Because the last time I let someone close, they destroyed me." His voice cracked then, raw and unpolished. "My father cheated, my mother shattered, and I swore I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me. Marriage was supposed to be safe with you because it wasn't built on love. Love is fragile, Imani. Love ruins. I thought if I kept you at a distance, I could protect us both." The confession hit me like a storm. I had never seen him vulnerable, never imagined his silence was anything but indifference. Now I saw the truth. It was fear. Fear that had built walls so high he had trapped himself inside them. Tears blurred my vision, anger and sorrow twisting together. "You don't get to use fear as an excuse to erase me," I whispered. I needed a husband, not a warden. He stepped closer, desperation in his eyes. "And I need you, Imani. For the first time in years, I need someone. I'm begging you. Don't walk away before I can prove that." My heart raced, torn between the ache of everything I had endured and the faint flicker of something I had always wanted from him. Honesty. It wasn't love yet, not forgiveness, but it was the first real truth he had ever given me. And standing there in my tiny studio in Queens, I realized this was the moment that would decide whether we remained broken or began again. The silence in the studio after Langston's confession felt heavier than the walls themselves. His words had cracked something open, and for the first time I saw not the polished billionaire heir, but a man carrying wounds he had never let heal. I wanted to turn him away, to protect myself from being hurt again, but my body betrayed me. My heart raced, my breath caught, and I knew there was still a part of me that longed for him to step across the distance at last. When he reached for me, It wasn't the careful, calculated gesture of a man in control. His hand trembled slightly as his fingers brushed mine, hesitant, as if asking permission. For once I didn't pull back. "Let me try," he whispered, his voice raw. "Not for the contract, not for appearances, for us." Something inside me broke then, the wall of anger and sorrow collapsing under the weight of his plea. Slowly I lifted my face to his, and in that moment he closed the gap that had haunted us for 14 long months. His lips pressed against mine, not cold, not distant, but hungry and desperate, as though he had been starving for this without ever admitting it. The kiss wasn't perfect. It was unsteady, filled with years of silence trying to speak at once. But it was real. His hands framed my face, his body leaned into mine, and for the first time I felt him present, fully, completely, undeniably there. When we finally pulled apart, my chest heaved and his forehead rested against mine. "I've wanted this," he confessed, his breath uneven. "God, I've wanted you." I was just too much of a coward to admit it. I didn't answer right away. The years of distance couldn't be erased with one kiss. But in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Vulnerability. The kind that stripped away every mask and every excuse. We left the studio together, neither of us speaking as we walked through the Harlem streets lit with neon and shadows. He guided me to a small boutique brownstone hotel near Mount Morris Park, a quiet refuge away from the glass cages of Central Park West. The room was warm, intimate, the kind of space where walls didn't tower but embraced. That night, he didn't treat me like a contract to be upheld or a ghost to be ignored. He treated me like a woman, like his wife, like someone who mattered. Every kiss, every touch was careful but filled with urgency, as if he was making up for every lost moment. For the first time, our bodies met with tenderness and honesty, not obligation. In his arms, I felt both the ache of all that had been wasted and the fragile promise of what could still be built. 6 months later, the woman who stared back at me from the mirror was not the same ghost who had once wandered through a silent penthouse. Life had color again. I had traded glass walls for sunlight, traded silence for laughter, traded invisibility for a love that was finally learning how to speak. Langston and I did not transform overnight. The wounds of the past 14 months could not be healed by a single kiss or even a single night. But he began to show up in ways I had once begged for. He sat beside me in Harlem cafes, listening as I read aloud the poetry I was brave enough to share again. He came to open mic nights at Uptown grounds, clapping louder than anyone when Jamal nodded proudly from the back of the room. He even began to cook with me, awkward in the kitchen but willing to learn, laughing when the rice burned and celebrating when the cornbread came out perfect. Our love was not flawless. It was fragile, uneven, messy, but it was alive. Each day, he worked to dismantle the walls he had built around his heart. Some nights, he would wake from restless dreams and whisper pieces of his past into the darkness, confessions he had buried for years, and I would listen, holding him until the weight eased. Other nights, he simply reached for my hand, and that was enough. Together, we started something new beyond ourselves. With my words and his resources, we created the Carter Harrington Literacy Foundation, based in Harlem. Its mission was simple but powerful: to bring books, mentorship, and opportunities to children who had been told their voices didn't matter. At the launch event, standing beside him at the Apollo Theater where our silence had once nearly destroyed us, I felt the difference like night and day. This time, when he introduced me, his voice was steady with pride. His hand warm on my back. I wasn't invisible anymore. Back in our home, not the glass fortress on Central Park West, but a restored brownstone in Bed-Stuy filled with warmth, music, and the smell of Sunday dinners. I finally felt what it meant to live inside love. My notebooks piled higher each week, filled not with longing for something I didn't have, but with poems about the life we were building. And every morning when I woke to Langston's arms around me, I didn't wonder if he saw me. I knew he did. For 14 months I had been nothing but a shadow in a contract. But now, under the sunlight streaming through open windows, I was something more. I was loved. I was free.